Hello, everyone. Welcome to my YouTube channel. To my audience on LinkedIn, good morning or good evening, wherever you are. To my audience on Zoom, thank you for joining us. I'm really excited to talk to my guest today, Jennifer Thompson, who is the founder of an organization called Healing Justice. And we're going to get into that a little more. A personal tragedy that she suffered, caused her to start this organization. And Jennifer, start telling us a little bit about what Healing Justice is, and then we're going to get into what happened to you that made you want to do this. Okay.
Yeah, Healing Justice is a national organization that I founded 9 years ago, launched in April of 2015. It seeks to really address the total harm that's caused in a wrongful conviction case. So we have built the organization using restorative justice principles, guidelines, and in an attempt to help create equity in the narratives of all harmed. So we recognize that it's not just an exonerated or wrongfully convicted man or woman that's hurt in these cases, but it's also their families, their parents they left behind, their children that grew up without them, the siblings that had to celebrate birthdays and holidays without a brother or a sister. But it's equally as important to recognize that the first person harmed in these cases are the crime victims, the crime survivors, the murder victim family members. And how do we talk about wrongful convictions in a more holistic and honest narrative so that we can understand that it isn't a single narrative, but it's really a multitude of stories and narratives that we need to really talk about and explore how do we heal from that space.
It's not just two people, it's a whole village that's hurt by this. You
Right.
were the victim of a very violent crime at knife point. You spent quite a bit of time with I'll say the criminal, uh, and you identified him to the police. Turned out he wasn't the one. I was reading through your book, and you talk in detail about the experience. And then in your book, when it comes to Ron Cotton, he's doing this thing. All of a sudden, the police are coming in, and he finds himself involved in this thing. So eventually, you identified him, and he went to prison for a certain amount of time, and then he was exonerated based on DNA. Is that correct?
It is. Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. And if it wasn't for DNA, a lot of people would still be in jail, right? And these issues would never come up. But
Well, yeah.
yeah, I mean, people they're exonerated other ways too, besides the DNA. But that seems to be the biggest, especially now with the science as it is now. So he goes to jail, right? And you find out that he's not the person. I want to focus on you as a victim. What went through your mind when you found that out?
Well, I mean, I think, first of all, let me just say that the 11 years between the crime that happened to me and Ron's exoneration is pretty complicated. It sounds neat and clean that there was just magically this DNA test happens and Ron was exonerated, but it's actually not the way most of these stories take place. For me, it was being traumatized at the beginning, almost being killed, taken to a hospital under unbelievable amounts of trauma, and then being asked to give my description, my memory to an officer that then is translated into a composite sketch that goes out to the community that leads to a suspect. And the suspect was indeed Ronald Cotton. I was called to the police station 3 days later to do a photographic lineup, and being told, to kind of look at 6 photographs, and you're 22 years old, you're pretty convinced that the person that's in that 6-person lineup, there's somebody in there that's the perpetrator, right? There's somebody in there that is the person who did this to me. And when I picked out Ronald's photograph, the response came back, "Good job, that's who we thought it was." And for the listeners and the viewers, that's important to understand because that's called confirmation bias, right? It's me being led to believe that I got it right, and therefore your memory becomes contaminated. And again, what's important for the listeners and viewers to understand is when someone's memory is contaminated, you can't uncontaminate it.
No, you actually get swayed into it, right?
It's suggestibility, it's malleable, it's all that stuff that goes into our memories. And it happens to all of us quite frequently, usually not under traumatic situations, but we're all being told information constantly that may not be true that we now believe to be true in our brains. And so when Ronald was charged and tried and convicted, the narrative given to me, the victim, is now that's done and over and you get to move on. Moving on from a brutal, violent crime is impossible.
Nobody can move on. You could be 100 years old.
You might move through.
But you can't move on. You never get over it.
Well, not only do you not get over it, Rudy, but your life is forever different. So
exactly.
It's just different. It's now changed forever. Ronald goes to serve his time. And yes, 11 years later, a DNA test is run. But lots of things took place before that DNA test was run, right? This is the state of North Carolina. There was no precedent to have a DNA test run. This is in 1995. It's very new. Scientific, evidence was still kind of confusing and not necessarily totally reliable. So Ronald was indeed exonerated 11 years later. And to get to your question, how did that make me feel as a crime victim or survivor? I don't know any other word than horrible, right? I mean, it's traumatic. Many of the survivors that I work with that are rape survivors that have been, within inches of death and have been led through the same type of flawed criminal justice system procedures that changes their memory, they'll tell you that moment they find out that the person that they thought had raped them and tried to kill them isn't the person, is oftentimes far worse than what happened to us. It's a complete paralyzing of my soul, right? The system failed. And Ronald spent 11 years in prison for something he didn't do. And the person who did this to me and another woman that night and knew Ronald was in prison for the crimes he had committed, stayed out in the community and committed 24 more violent crimes before he was ever apprehended. So that knowledge that there was so much failure and so much harm done by this single person, right? This person, Bobby Poole, who with malice and intent did what he did to all of us. But that wasn't the narrative in the media. That wasn't the story that was put out there for the media to feed on.
They don't focus on the victims. It seems that the media hasn't really focused, in my opinion, sufficiently on the victim.
Well, when they do focus on the victim, Rudy, it is to blame the victim. It is, and even in some of the stories that we work with where the victims were raped and murdered, they even get blamed for their own murder. So we just have this victim blaming culture. And it's still very, it's very traumatizing.
Victim blaming and victim shaming.
Both. It's just both. The media loves it. The general public loves it. We want to blame somebody, and boy, the first person they can sink their teeth in is the victim. And so not only do we get erased out of the narrative of what happened to us, but then we get blamed for the failure
And when the victim, there are cases where the victim recants and the prosecutor doesn't believe them. Well, we've got enough other evidence, or we don't believe her story. I think it's a very broken system. I used to be a criminal defense lawyer. And one of the questions I asked the jury is, how many of you believe my client's guilty? And of course, some people would raise their hand, they immediately get disqualified. But I would say to them, my client is as pure as a fresh fallen snow, because it's up to them to prove that he did this thing, okay? And don't assume just because he's here. And so what happens is people think where there's smoke, there's fire, you know, and if he didn't do this wrong, he must have done something wrong. And they don't take into account the effect. The police sometimes just want to close a case quickly. And they want to just close it, go on to the next one, and they talk themselves into believing, well, we've got the right guy. And even, do you agree that even when they find out that this may not be the person, they still try to find some justification for their decision because they don't want to admit they made a mistake?
Well, I do think it happens, Rudy, but I think that's baked into the cake.
Yes.
Baked into the cake of our system. Our system is adversarial. It's win at all costs, and you're going to lose, or you're going to win. And I know in my case, our detective, who was the first person on the scene and became the captain of the police department, became a huge hero in changing basic law enforcement training manuals and eyewitness identification procedures as soon as this happened. I mean, as soon as he realized that a mistake had been made, and he has since then really tried hard to be a vanguard, a leader in the movement of, correcting many of the issues that result in wrongful convictions. And I think there's enough, if we want to blame people, we can. There's enough to toss that around. But again, at the end of the day, Ronald could never have been wrongfully convicted if Bobby Poole hadn't been out there raping women and hurting us. And so I still like to always bring these stories back in cases where there is a crime. We also know there's wrongful conviction cases where there was no crime.
Exactly.
It was an accident, and it was investigated as something totally different. But in these cases where a crime has occurred, there can't be a wrongful conviction unless there's a bad person hurting people. And I just think people need to understand that. And when we don't have the actual guilty perpetrator being held accountable, then
more crimes.
Well, then we all lose.
Yes.
We all lose. Every single one of us. My point that I like to make is there are no winners in wrongful conviction cases except the perpetrator.
That is correct. And it's more than just the victim. It's more than just the accused. It's, as you said earlier, the family, the stigma sometimes. But when this happened to you, there were no services you can avail yourself of, right? And you're the first person that started some type of movement through Healing Justice to bring healing not just to the victims, but to everybody. Okay, victims' families, the wrongfully accused, all those things. I mean, nobody's done that until you started doing that.
Right.
What made you want to start? What motivated you?
I think the simple answer is I got tired. I got tired of sitting in space with the victims and the exonerees and the mothers and the children and the siblings and hearing their stories and knowing that there was nothing for us when these convictions are overturned. Like when the conviction's overturned, everybody just thinks, well, that's done, right? The victim is left with nothing. The victim is erased from their story. The victim's blamed for it. The exonerees, getting the pat on his or her back and maybe their first meal, and there's lots of pictures being taken, and it's like, yay, he or she's free. And then what? Then what happens, right? We're all left to try to figure out what does this next part look like and how difficult that is, because it's very isolating. It's very lonely. And I would sit with crime victims and survivors that would literally say to me, I feel like I want to die. I would watch exonerees be like on the verge of going back to prison or self-harming or addictions. And I thought, well, this is crazy. Like the system harmed us all. And shouldn't the system be responsible for providing some measure of repair? And that was not happening. And so I just decided to take a leap of faith and thought, you know what? Maybe I'll fail, but I know I'm going to fail if I never try. So I'm going to try.
I've always said, do not underestimate the power of one. Do not estimate the power of one determined person. There were there services, there's crime victims units, every prosecutor has them, but it seems that they only deal with the victim during the crime itself and during the process, the trial, but that really stops afterwards, doesn't it?
Yeah, well, for the most part, yes. I mean, what we were seeing is there were victim advocates and victim services in pretrials. And then once a conviction was made, just like myself, victims kind of walk away and are told that's done, right? And I just get nuts when people use the word closure, right? Now you have closure. And we don't know that this case is never going to be done. There's always going to be appeals. There's always going to be motions for appropriate release. There's probation, there's parole, there's clemency, there's commutation. There's all kinds of procedures that take place after conviction, but victims don't know that. We're told that this is the end. This is the end. And so then we're dropped. We're just dropped. And there's nobody in that post-conviction space that understood or was available to victims in that space. And so when we kind of came along, we took up really a lot of post-conviction space. Now, because we are seeing this huge growth in conviction integrity units, conviction review units that are popping up all over the place, there are now some of these units that have a victim's advocate, and we work directly with many of these agencies and training them and teaching them and educating them how best to respond to crime victims in these spaces when victims and survivors are now being told, oh, guess what? The sentence is up for review. The sentence is being reversed. The sentence is being resentenced. How do we respond to victims in those spaces that are now going to be hurt again?
There was a study that you were part of, right? That says sometimes the re-victimization is even harder than the actual crime was committed.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
In terms of the emotional trauma.
Right.
And how does that, you know, when you just say it, somebody might think, I don't think that, I want to be clear, I don't think that, but somebody might think, well, what could be worse than the crime? Mm-hmm. Tell them, why is this worse than in some cases than the original crime?
Because you trusted the system. You trusted the system. So you at least had that, right? I trusted the system. System said they got it right. I trusted that. And now the system's saying, well, not so much. And not only did we fail and we got it wrong, but for many, many, many of these victims and survivors, they will never know who killed their brother, who raped and tortured and murdered their mother, who raped them when they were 8 years old. They may never know because no one's going to bother looking into it because it's now a cold case or statute of limitations has taken effect.
That's another big problem. Yes. Some cases.
Yeah. So for many of these crime survivors and victims, it is like another letdown, another disappointment. And it is so isolating. It's so isolating. How do you talk to somebody about this, right? How do you look at somebody and say, this happened to me 15 years ago or 23 years ago, and now this person's been exonerated. We don't know who killed my brother. They're not going to find out, or they do know, but he's under a witness protection program. I mean, there's so many failures, and it's just disappointment and disappointment and trauma just layered and layered and layered and layered and layered on top of each other.
And the media, who has a tendency, as we all know, I mean, I'm not saying anything new, to sensationalize things. They seem to focus more on the wrongfully accused, and as you said, ignore, the victim and what the victim's going through. Do you think part of that is just the ignorance of our society? And when do you think, I guess when you started doing this, perhaps more awareness, you brought more awareness to this, where people, wait a minute, people, there's more than just one thing wrong. There's
Right.
more than just one innocent person going to jail. There
Right.
is all these other victims. And what you said really resonates with me, and that is the system let you down.
Mm-hmm.
And you grow up learning to trust the police. You grow up learning that they don't have any bias, that they want to do what's right. But in my tenure as a criminal defense lawyer, I've seen prosecutors anxious to get a conviction. I've seen police officers anxious to close a case, and they just want to close it. They don't really care at that point. And that I think is another inherent problem in the system.
Mm-hmm.
So what are some of the things you do to bring these people together to ease the pain for each? Tell us about some of the programs you have, and what's been the most effective in your world?
Well, if we're talking about healing.
Yes, the healing
Yes.
process. Mm-hmm.
So one of the things that we did very, very early on is we knew and we realized that the experts in the subject matter, wrongful conviction, harm, pain, loss, longing, grief, the experts were the people who had survived it. So if we were going to build a program that addressed that, then we needed to first listen to people who had experienced it. And what was that experience like? And so we first did several listening sessions that we convened, family members of exonerees, and crime victims and survivors. And we listened through a facilitated, day-long event. What did they need then? What do they need now? What does healing look like? And from that, we were able to begin to build what we call our healing justice retreats. Our retreats are based on restorative justice principles. So if you don't know what restorative justice is, it asks 3 questions. The 3 questions that are asked are, how were you harmed? What do you need to repair? And whose obligation is it to repair that? Those are the 3 questions asked in restorative justice. Now, in wrongful conviction cases, the obligation to repair is the perpetrator, right?
Mm-hmm.
But the perpetrator, more often than not, is unknown to us. There's very few of these cases where the perpetrator is actually known. And even rarer, a perpetrator who is willing to acknowledge that they hurt all of these people. So then the next party that would then, logically be responsible for the repair would be the criminal justice system. Wasn't going to happen.
Correct.
This wasn't going to happen. So then we began to think about, well, then what does repair look like if we sit in space with individuals that have similar shared experiences as us, but might be different, right? So for a rape survivor to be able to sit in a healing justice retreat with someone who was exonerated from a sexual assault, or a murder victim family member, to sit in a circle with someone who was exonerated from murder, and to be able to listen to those experiences, listen to those stories, lean into each other, see each other, create a safe space for each other. And so our healing justice retreats are based on the restorative justice principles. It is 4 days and 3 nights where we literally sit in circles And I lead them through lots of different activities that can address some of those questions and some of those hurts and some of those griefs.
But
And we
those
do that.
retreats, those retreats have the, the victims and the exonerees together, or are they
Yes,
separate?
very
Okay.
rarely from the same case, Rudy.
Okay.
Very, very rarely from the
Okay.
same case. And the reason for that is because crime survivors and crime victims and murder victim family members have been treated so badly in these cases and been so marginalized and so ignored and so unnoticed and so erased, they want nothing to do with anybody. They don't trust anybody.
And you don't blame them, really, you don't blame the victim or the accused for not trusting anybody. The study also points out that there's some fear on the part of the victim that the exonerated person may come after them, for, as retaliation.
Sure. That's a natural fear. Absolutely. Because we don't know that person. We know what the system and the trial transcripts and the narratives and the stories told us in court, right? That's the only thing that we know was the stuff that we were told. So we don't know that person. We only know the monster that was created. We don't know the actual man or woman that sat at that table. And
we just
nor
know
do
there
they
was a
know
monster.
us. Right. And they don't know us either. Many of the exonerees will say, like, I think that the crime victims probably still hate me. And so creating these spaces for people to step into, even if it's using individuals as a surrogate in place of someone else, but has a similar experience, can be very, very healing.
The reason I think I agree with you that people from the same crime may not be a good idea to have them both at the same retreat, but at the very least, it gives other people a perspective of what they're going through. So the exoneree hearing somebody who's a victim of a totally different crime and event may start to humanize in some respect the person that accused them, and maybe start to understand that it wasn't, necessarily out of malice, but, it was a system failing.
Well, they can also understand what the experiences were like during the 10 years, 15 years, 20 years. I mean, I have many, many like vignettes from these retreats, but one of the ones that is particularly important that I think about a lot is hearing an exoneree say, I never knew about what those years were like for you and your family. Like, I'm in prison. I don't know. I can imagine, but I don't know. And to be able to sit with a person who can say, these were my experiences, that, my daughter was murdered, and every Christmas we couldn't hang up her stocking, that every birthday we couldn't even say her name. Those are important stories to hear because you don't realize what each person is suffering from. And there's a lot of common threads. And the common threads are we're grieving. And what we're grieving is not always, and not just necessarily, the absence of a person's body in our life, but it is the lost opportunities we had, the longings to return to this thing, this place where we used to be. That is a grief. And to hear that from each other is really powerful. And it can create, as I say, it creates a community.
I think it creates empathy. I think it creates, some type of connection.
Sure. It creates community, which builds connections. And when we build connections with each other, then we create spaces of belonging. And belonging, when we can create spaces of belonging, that's where we create healing. That's where we heal. We heal in spaces of belonging, not in othering, but in belonging. And if we can create safe communities to build connections, then we can create that belonging, and people can begin to help each other heal. They can help themselves heal. It's really quite remarkable.
Time is also an enemy in many respects because these things take so long. And too often in the past, prosecutors have been reluctant to disrupt the life of the victim, and they don't tell them, hey, there's been this claim of innocence. Then all of a sudden, exoneration, and boom, the victim's notified. Oh my God, the guy was exonerated. I'm not a psychologist, but to me, it seems that the more time you have to process that the person may not be the one, gives you more time for healing. And I think maybe have an ally in helping exonerate this wrongfully accused man, or, improperly accused man.
Well,
So
Rudy,
would you
like to join? Would you like to join us for a training session? Because that is exactly what we say all the time. We're constantly saying, please give these people time to process. Not only the time to process, Rudy, which you said, perfectly, time to kind of understand what's going on, to ask the questions we need to ask. But the other thing that happens if we do it properly is we can actually give crime victims and survivors and family members some power and agency, right? We strip their agency away when we make decisions for them and say things like, well, we don't want to re-traumatize them, so we'll just wait till the very last second.
Except that it's not a psychologist, it's not a social worker making that decision. It's a prosecutor with a police officer with no training in that area whatsoever, who just his own opinion or her own opinion thinks, well, I don't want to bother them, right? And I think that's the worst thing that can happen. I think they need time to process this and
Right.
and to possibly be part of the solution.
Part of the solution if they choose to, but at least
Yeah.
be able to ask questions that need to be answered, that they deserve answers to.
Yeah, it's amazing that until you came along, no resources were allocated for this.
No.
I should tell my audience I saw you on 60 Minutes and I was really impressed. And so I reached out to you on LinkedIn. So those of you who think LinkedIn's not a powerful tool, here's my guest to show that you can communicate with people. And I thought this would be something really, really, really good to talk about, because it's truly, been ignored. Now, what are some of the comments, and I don't want you to identify individuals, but what are some of those common comments that you get from the victims after leaving the session, and then from the exonerated? And by the way, we have to choose our words carefully, because you say exonerated, right? You don't use the word wrongfully accused. And there's a reason for that, right?
Yeah, I mean, I do not say wrongfully accused. I don't use that term because I think the word accused is loaded.
Mm-hmm.
And it's loaded as it relates to the crime victims and survivors. When I think about accusations, I think about Birth of a Nation. I think about To Kill a Mockingbird. I think about these stories where someone is just kind of making up a story that never happened. But for victims and survivors, we're not accusing anybody. The system brings us.
You're just saying what happened. You're just saying what happened.
I tell you what happened. I'm giving you what I know. The police, the detectives are creating composite sketches and lineups and whatever that they're going to show to me. I'm led through a procedure which we now know can be very, very flawed, and then led down this path, believing that the system got it right, only to be told that it failed. And so I don't use the word accusations. I do go back and forth saying wrongfully convicted and exonerated. And the reality is there's not that many exonerees. We have lots and lots of convictions that have been overturned, but an actual exoneration is a DNA exoneration for the most part. And out of the 3,500 convictions that have been overturned, we only have 550, 600 DNA exonerations. So to your point at the very beginning, many of the people that have been wrongfully convicted have been freed on other.
Well, there are technical issues, evidentiary issues,
Brady violations,
police
junk
withholding
science.
evidence, exactly.
Yes,
all those things.
right.
That's been the case.
And
You
they're
know,
all important. They're all important.
they're all important. No, definitely. Blackstone said it's better that 10, was it Blackstone? That, innocent people go free, guilty people go free to protect the innocents who are accused. And if we don't have these procedures, imagine how much worse it would be. At least we've got some type of process. When I've seen these news, because when you decided to do this interview, I stopped, I Googled, people who've been, exonerated, and very seldom is there a mention of the victim. A lot. Usually they'll, in a sense, by innuendo, shame the victim. And, you're sitting in your living room watching this, and there's nothing about you, but the perception is, oh my God, you're the person that did this, So that's shaming again. That's going through a whole series of emotions again, being guilty. It's crazy.
It is crazy. It is absolutely crazy. I will tell you that I know many, many, many crime victims and survivors. I can tell you every single one of them has two things in common. One is they want the person who hurt them or their family to be held accountable. They don't want an innocent person to go to prison. They want the person who hurt them to be held accountable. And the other thing that is absolutely 100% across the board is they don't want something like this to ever happen to another person.
And you're working at that. I mean, some of the other solutions are, have professional people to provide support services for the victims, and not just people who are in law enforcement, right? That to me is the most important thing. And someone with formal training, somebody who can talk to them, and also peer support groups of people that have empathy with them.
Well, that's what these, healing retreats really are kind of based on. We have two different models, Rudy. We have peer support retreats where it might just only be victims and survivors,
right?
Only exonerees. And then we have what's called the mixed retreats, which is kind of bringing in the different groups. But we do have peer support programs that we provide at Healing Justice, the healing retreats. We have lots of different programs, and if there's anyone out there that's interested in learning more, of course, I hope everybody goes on the Healing Justice website, which is healingjusticeproject.org, and learn more about the programs that we offer. We even have an exoneree handbook that's on our website that is free, can be downloaded. It was done and written by convening listening sessions with exonerees and collecting what worked and what didn't work, and that we've designed this entire resource handbook for exonerated men and women, that when they are released, they can download this, and it provides peer support, but it also has lots and lots of different resources connected to it. No one thought about that either. Like, no one thought about any of this. It was just, hey, you're free now, good luck. And a lot of us will tell you that it's the aftermath that's the hardest space, right? It's when the cameras go away. It's kind of like any other type of grief, right? When the casseroles are eaten, when people stop visiting your home and telling you how sorry they are that someone you loved has passed away. It's that next 6 months that's the loneliest. It's the hardest, because you're in it and you're alone in it, and you're trying to figure it out by yourself. And
the analogy to a funeral is a good analogy, because when a loved one passes away, you'll get some support, but it's going to stop, and it's going to stop sooner than later.
People return to their lives.
Something that's interesting, I'll tell you, for a while, I represented the police in a major metropolitan area. I represented the police union, and I used to get called out when there was a police shooting. And because I lived in the city, I was close by. I got there before internal affairs. I got there before everyone else did. But they always sent 2 officers who were involved in the shootings to counsel, not give legal advice, but to counsel the officer. Because I don't care how skilled you are with a gun, and I've seen this in multiple shootings I've been to, you're like this, you're shaken up, you know. And so they have those type of services for the police officers doing the shooting, but they completely ignore, you know, the victims. They think there are other people who, you know, who will take care of them. That's not our job. You know, we're here to take care of our own. Now, do you think that there's, how many people have you serviced, have you helped in this process since you began?
I mean,
Rough
that's really,
numbers. I don't need an exact number.
it varies, Rudy, to be honest with you, because we have kind of two different sides of healing justice, right? We do a lot of our justice work, which is with prosecutors' offices, conviction integrity units, conviction review units, and we've in those spaces, we've worked with hundreds and hundreds of individuals that are then providing services for victims and survivors on these notifications. In the healing space, we've done over 20 retreats, which we keep small on purpose. We keep the numbers very small, 15, 12 to 15 people in the retreats. We had 20 of those, but we also do a lot of virtual work and then the peer support. So the numbers are hard to give you an actual country number, but if I was to put both of those numbers together, gosh, I would literally say thousands and thousands, because it's the ripple effect as well, right? You help the rape survivor who goes home and realizes that she no longer wants to be using painkillers, and that helps her family. So honestly, thousands.
Well, and that's good from a small group too.
Yes, we're a mighty little organization that works really hard.
Well, and thank God you have social media now. You have a lot of platforms where before you didn't have those. Where do you get the bulk of your contributions from, or your funding?
It varies. We have, of course, private donations, good people who want to donate and help support our work. All of our donations go directly to our programs. Of course, we pay for our staff, but our staff is who runs the programs. So private donations are really essential. We also have our third Department of Justice grant. So that's been hugely beneficial and successful. We have some foundation money. And then, to be transparent, I started the organization with my own dollars. So I'm a big part of it. I try very hard to put in everything that I can, whether it's, time or treasure.
What was the reaction to the Justice Department and law enforcement when you approached them about this? Were they reluctant at the beginning, or were they easily said, this is a great idea? How was
the Department of Justice, yes. I mean, they've been very supportive of our work since the very, very beginning. I mean, I kicked off Healing Justice when I was awarded the Special Courage Award from the Office for Victims of Crime. So they've known about me for a while, have seen my work, have been very helpful and supportive of our work. The system, like police, prosecutors, public defenders, honestly, this, Rudy, it depends on where you're talking about. There are certain jurisdictions that are very supportive and want to know more and want to be part of it. And then there's some parts of our country that
don't care.
Well, it's not that they don't care. I don't think they see it as a problem, to be honest with you. And it's not until you can sit with people and explain to them why it really is a problem, that they get it. I mean, I've had investigators and police and prosecutors and all kinds of people in the system kind of look at me and say, gosh, oh my God,
I didn't realize this. Holy cow.
Yeah. Or they've said, I never thought about the victims. And I scratch my head and think, how do you not think about the victims? Like, how is that even possible?
Well, they're trained to stop crime, right? The prosecutors are trained to prosecute. The police are trained to investigate, find the, person more, who's guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. Okay. It was never, I think it was just never the focus. I mean, crime victim assistance hasn't been around all that long compared to the length of our justice system.
Right. And victims historically in court proceedings are evidence.
Exactly. How well are they going to come across as evidence,
Yeah. And once they're done with us, they're done with us.
I'm a big Sherlock Holmes fan. I've seen every Sherlock Holmes episode. And what amazes me, and of course this is only in the movies, is he walks into a room and he sees everything from a little speck of hair to the type of mud in there. People are just not that observant because they're not trained like Sherlock Holmes. We just live daily lives. And when something tragic happens, your image, your senses are distorted.
They're distorted. The other thing that people really don't understand and realize, and I didn't either, so I'm not trying to criticize anybody. I didn't understand this myself until it happened to me. But human beings and our brains are not wired to see, as you said, with Sherlock Holmes, the totality, right? Our brain compartmentalizes things, right?
Focus on certain things, not necessarily the whole picture.
Right. And so it's, when you're under trauma and there's something happening to your body, for instance, in my story where there's a knife to my throat, my focus that night was, where is the knife?
Well, I would think your focus is on staying alive, and then
my focus is on staying alive. Where's that knife? Where's that knife? How can I get him away from me? How can I get the knife off of my throat? And that's the focus. And, people can be critical about, and which they are, about crime victims and survivors and eyewitness identification and lineups and why didn't you do this and why didn't you do this and, whatever. Until you're in that position, until you've gone through something like that, I really kind of don't want to hear your opinion.
Eyewitness testimony is probably the most unreliable testimony because if, for example, I'm sitting there and I see somebody from a distance robbing a bank, I see them running to the car, I'm not emotionally in it. And I can say, well, he was 5'2", had red hair, I couldn't see his eyes, he drove a Pinto. I don't think people drive Pintos anymore, but and you can do it objectively. But when you're the victim, it's really hard for you to be objective and say, gee, let me remember what this guy looks like for the police. In your case, as in many other cases, they're just trying to stay alive and be damaged the least amount possible.
Yeah, and then other things come into our brain, between that space and the time that you give an identification. So again, we started talking about this at the very beginning. Our brains are malleable. Things can be said to us that are suggestive, that begins to change our original memory. So for instance, you see somebody robbing a bank or, carjacking, and your initial thought is, oh gosh, he's 5'7" with brown hair and a blue shirt. And the police just saw a guy running down the street that's 5'7" with blonde hair and a green shirt. And they may look at you and say, well, could it have been a green shirt? And you say, well, I'm pretty sure it was blue, but could it have been a greenish blue shirt? And pretty soon your memory is becoming contaminated. And by the time you say, well, I guess it could have been a green shirt. I mean, it could have been a green shirt. Your memory's now changed. And again, I want to believe, because I just have a faith that I think most police officers are trying to do the right thing. But the wrong thing happens.
We don't live in a vacuum is the problem. And there are so many things that blur our senses, that distort our senses, and one of which is the adrenaline flowing, the fear flowing, fear for your life, all that comes in. So to me, the most unreliable testimony is that of a witness in a traumatic situation, saying this is the person. Yet, many people have been convicted on that testimony. And, especially when you have younger victims, you were a young victim at the time. You weren't, I guess, worldly in the sense that you weren't in your 40s or 50s and, lived a lot. You're still in your not seeing all the bad stuff in the world. You were a young lady. Okay. And you learned to trust the system, but I think I think it's changing now, especially since I've seen your website and see what you do. I think there needs to be more with that, and more compassion for the victim and some empathy for the criminal, or not necessarily the criminal. I mean, the person who's been exonerated, because what I've seen happen before is, if he's not guilty of this, he's guilty of something.
Yeah, I hear that too.
We just happen to catch him for this, but this guy's lifelong criminal, and that really shouldn't matter in our system. But that's the unconscious bias of sometimes law enforcement to say, well, we're going to get this guy off the street anyway, and so yes, let's close our case and do it.
Right.
The system is overworked. It's a complicated society now. And there's a lot more media attention on things than there were, in the 1940s and 50s. I mean, before, in the 1940s and 50s, if a woman was raped, somehow this seemed like it was her fault. Where were you? Why weren't you doing what you...
Rudy, that's still the story.
It's still the same? They kind of say, well, it's your fault. Why were you there if it would happen? It's just horrible. Nobody ever asked for anything bad to happen to them. And that's the thing. Nobody, and somebody who thinks like that is honestly, I think, sometimes devoid of consciousness. I mean, do you actually think that somebody goes into a place with the intent of having some harm done to them?
Right.
I mean, you look at what happens to the school. You think your schools are safe, and look at these crazies go in and start shooting it up. I mean, we want to be safe. We'd rather avoid this mess, right? And through the stigma. Well, it's 7:54. I want to thank you so much for doing this. You, by the way, and my other guests might be mad, but you are my favorite guest, okay?
Yay!
I want to thank you for doing this. I want to leave people with three things, okay? What three pieces of advice? Well, one of them is donate money, donate time. You can send a link in the chat. But what are the three things you want people to remember from this interview? Because we talked about a lot of things.
The first one is what we've been talking about, which is stop victim blaming. Like, just stop victim blaming. Don't blame victims. Don't blame survivors. In these wrongful conviction cases, and you and I chatted about this before, but there are no winners except the perpetrator. That's the only winner. So victim blaming is never, ever okay. The other thing that I want people to understand is when these wrongful conviction cases occur, it is, as I said in the 60 Minutes piece, it is not a single bullet. It is a bomb that goes off. And there's so many people that are hurt for every single wrongful conviction case. The victims, our families, the innocent man and woman, their families, but the community. Bobby Poole committed 24 more violent crimes before he was ever caught. So the community was lulled into a sense of safety, and it was false. And jurors get hurt. The jurors that are sitting on these cases open up the newspaper 30 years later, and they're hurt. I believe police, prosecutors, judges, public defenders, defense attorneys, we're all hurt when the system fails us. And then I guess the last point is the idea about healing. You know, we are living in such a divisive time. And if we can somehow, each person, just create these spaces where people can step into and feel safe to tell their stories, to step into authenticity, transparency, vulnerability, I believe that we can begin like a healing across communities, across races, across genders, across, you know, all kinds of lines, if we can just hear each other's stories. But we can't do that unless we create spaces that are safe.
I would add one other thing to that, I think, is that the system is broken still.
Now, Rudy, you and I have been talking for almost an hour. I'm going to disagree with you. I don't think the system is broken at all. I think the system works exactly the way it was designed to work. And I think it was designed to fail poor people, people of color. I think it was designed to fail.
That's why I think the system is broken, because it doesn't protect them. And you know, being a criminal defense lawyer and seeing what I've seen, yeah, the system can be plenty broke. It's the only system we have. I remember a judge once said to me, well, we don't have a system of justice, we have a system of laws. You know, laws may not necessarily be fair, but
then those laws are human beings.
Exactly, who make them, and they have the same frailties. Well,
and also human beings that get hurt. So
yeah, they get hurt and they react, and there's all kinds of biases, both unconscious and intentional. Well, I want to thank everyone in my LinkedIn crowd for tuning in. Thank you again, Jennifer, for appearing. It's really was an honor to have you on my show. And now I'm going to stop the recording